Hello, Zero Books readers. In this YouTube video, we're going to take a look at a rising star from the anti-PC movement. We're going to start a process whereby we take Jordan Peterson seriously, with the aim of going beyond the culture of cloistered internet communities and the arguments and ideas both sides put forward. These days, it has become nearly impossible to engage ideas. What happens instead is that right and left-wing figures both create units of self-contained or packaged content that gather clicks and revenue, but do little to inspire thought. Still, before we start picking apart the current political moment, it's necessary to pay respect to the Zero Books author, Mark Fisher, who recently died far too young. Along with writing Capitalist Realism, a book that put Zero Books on the map back in 2009, Mark was brave enough to wade into this swamp of political correctness and the debate around that. Or as he would put it, he was brave enough to enter the vampire castle. Back in 2013, Mark Fisher wrote an essay for a left periodical called The North Star, called Exiting the Vampire Castle. And in that, he notes that the left, and especially left-wing Twitter, can often be a miserable, dispiriting zone. And he said that the left had become driven by the priest's desire to excommunicate and condemn, the academic pedant's desire to be the first to be seen to spot a mistake, and the hipster's desire to be one of the in crowd. Put that way, Fisher's criticism seems familiar, too familiar even. These days it's difficult to go 2 clicks without hearing pretty much the same sentiment from a myriad of YouTube stars and Twitter warriors who, once you scratch the surface, are diametrically opposed to Fisher and his politics.
His thinking is exactly the same as a feminist SJW. Marxism is Marxism is Marxism. It behaves the same way no matter what you apply it to.
So how is it that on the surface at least, Fisher and these anti-PC YouTubers appear to agree? Well, to understand what's going on, let's take a look at a specific anti-PC warrior, a personality who's been getting a lot of attention lately, and take a look underneath his hood.
Protest against you watched all of your videos. It's like, do you want to disavow?
I have 150 videos on YouTube.
No, your lectures, which sparked the debate.
Okay.
Do you want to disavow the support?
Could you let me talk to her for a moment?
Don't call me that, please.
Jordan Peterson has taken what at least looks like a principled stance towards an expansion of the Canadian Human Rights Act and Criminal Code. The new provision was introduced in May of 2016, and it aims to add legal protection based on gender identity and gender expression. It is likely that this provision will be interpreted by the courts to include the right to be identified by a person's self-identified pronoun, and Peterson absolutely refuses to abide by this interpretation of the law. He will not use non-binary pronouns, and he feels that to require him to do so would be a violation of his right to free speech and free thought. He does not believe that words like V and verself, fey and fair self, or pers and perself are meaningful. Now, the topic of non-binary gender pronouns is one fraught with peril. People have strong feelings about it, and there is an impulse to come to the defense of transsexuals who have very concrete and real struggles. But what's more interesting, more important than Peterson's stance towards non-binary pronouns, which, let's admit, can't be conflated with a stance towards transsexuals or transsexual rights, is his stance toward the significance of and source of meaning in society. That is, the more abstract or philosophical question of meaning is really what drives Peterson and his politics. And it's only when we realize this and we look at what Peterson's philosophy is that we can understand him as fundamentally a figure of the conservative right.
And I believe in land raising from the bottom of the ocean with ancient ruins on it, like the ruins of Thule. And I believe that Trump's going to accomplish all of that. How? now, he's going to prove that UFOs exist. The government has known about it for a long time. They've known that the UFOs...
Consider this. Peterson describes the purpose of his book, Maps of Meaning, this way. I understand, finally, that the world that stories describe is not the objective world, but the world of value, and that it is in this world that we live, first and foremost. Now, Peterson has jammed a lot into this one sentence, condensed his main claim down into something that could almost be a slogan. The world that our stories describe is the world of value rather than the world of scientific or even philosophical truth. And this world of value is where we live. It's actually an extremely deflationary claim, but it may not appear to be right on the surface. Peterson is abandoning rationality as the foundation for our social life, maybe even abandoning reason.
In many ways, what happened was that Jung picked up where Nietzsche left off and tried to solve the problems that Nietzsche left unsolved. So it was Nietzsche, for example, in some sense, along with Dostoevsky, who really definitively announced the death of God at the end of the 19th century. And that left people, in some ways, bereft of belief. And we're going to talk about why that's so important in a moment. What Jung was doing was trying to rescue the father from the underworld, in a sense. He tried to go back to the religious traditions that Nietzsche had described as fatally anachronistic and demolished by the claims of science. He attempted to go back to those religious traditions and reassess them from a psychological perspective to pull back the necessary meaning that was embedded in them so that people could reunite with their culture and in principle not be so prone to pathological belief systems like ideology that tend to rush in where there's a gap. And Nietzsche said very clearly, and Dostoevsky knew this as well, by the end of the 19th century, is that the death of God would mean that people would turn en masse to rationalistic ideologies, and that would be murderous. They knew that was coming, and that's an amazing prediction. It really is amazing.
What Peterson is pushing with his slogan is Jung's critique of modernity, Jung's critique of secular society, and Jung's critique of Marxist utopia. Peterson holds with a view that blames the loss of traditional values, the loss of meaning, on secular scientific society. Stalin, Mao, and Hitler are all of a piece for Peterson, and in each case the culprit or cause behind the violence isn't political, but psychological. Hitler took power because, as Jung would put it, science destroyed all previous traditions and thereby cut humanity off from its own unconscious world. Where the old myths gave life and spirit to the world, the new forms of rational knowledge left man in a state bereft of meaning and alienated from life.
About some of the main ideas in my new book, Ghosts of My Life, which really in some ways runs parallel to, or is the other side of, the kind of ideas that I deal with in capitalist realism, really. If capitalist realism was about the complete takeover of capital, of not only of culture and economy, but also of the psyche, then Ghosts of My Life deals with what was thwarted by that, the traces of the outside, the persistences of exteriority in this world completely dominated by capital. So yeah, to come back then. So what is the bad news we already know? Is that the dimension of the future has disappeared. That in some ways that we're marooned, we're trapped in the 20th century still.
What's most interesting about Jordan Peterson then is not all the various ways he and his conservatism go wrong, but the way his insistence that we live in a world of meaning, his dissatisfaction with the secular world and its chaos, his despair and defiance against the half measures societies offer, is the consequence of a very real alienation. The problem Peterson is grappling with is not a different problem from the one Fisher wrestled with in Ghosts of My Life, or capitalist realism. Fisher was future-oriented and experienced alienation as inertia, while Peterson nostalgically attempts to resuscitate the past in order to slow down the tide of unrelenting flux and change, but both describe the world as having slipped away from us. Both seek after a new and more human life. Again, merely disagreeing with Peterson is not enough, as this leaves us in the position of defending the status quo. So for instance, let's take up Jung's rather soft argument against suicide. This is perhaps one of his strongest arguments against our secular and scientific society, namely that a people without recourse to myths and meaning are threatened by an impulse towards self-destruction that may appear entirely rational and that can even be systematically rationalized and institutionalized.
Today is the day Simon is going to leave us. This is the siren.
Simon is very confident, but do you always feel anxious at this point? How do you feel emotionally?
Always bear in mind, it's her decision. Until the very last moment, I will be asking her, you want to go through? And did you really? Are you decided? It is very difficult to really decide that the psychic suffering is unbearable. But on the other hand, if a person makes the decision that he or she doesn't want to live anymore, you don't want to suffer.
Jung wrote, "The idea of suicide, understandable as it is, does not seem commendable to me. We live in order to gain the greatest possible amount of spiritual development and self-awareness. As long as life is possible, even if only in a minimal degree, you should hang on to it. To interrupt life before its time is to bring to a standstill an experiment which we have not set up. We have found ourselves in the midst of it and must carry it through to the end."
Amai, dat was heel beslist. Het kon niet rap genoeg binnen zijn.
It's hard not to side with Jung as we watch the efficient, depersonalized, and purely rational death of Simone, an elderly but otherwise physically healthy woman whose Belgian doctor authorized and then administered euthanasia. What is there in Jung's lines that a leftist would disagree with? What is there in the administration of poisons to men and women who are no longer of any use because our society only values people based on their utility to defend?
It's over.
Nazis and white supremacists assaulting people at your protest. Do you have any comment on that?
Yeah, I don't like Nazis.
Then why were they here?
Yeah, when I saw the video that you put up, was it 2 days ago now? I think.
Yep.
Yeah, 2 days ago. I couldn't believe it. Yeah, and the next morning I got an email from my brother who also studies symbolism and is a very smart person, and he said, "Does Jordan know he's incarnating Pepe right now?"
The objection to Jung, then, isn't with his aim of creating the conditions for a meaningful life, but with his reliance on mystification to ground these meanings. What we object to is the reduction of meaning to the level of a private concern, as this assures that public life, as meaningless as it is, will never change.
So I went and listened to Kermit and I thought, oh yeah, I do have a voice that's similar to that. I can get it lower, but my voice tends to rise up into my, it's because of tension. So
this is it. We need to do the metaphysics of Pepe. No one has done it yet, I think.
Jordan Peterson has become internet famous. His position towards gender-neutral pronouns has brought him an audience, not because of some general moral failure in society, not because of transphobia or homophobia, but because the conflicts around gender identity are rife with the kinds of internal contradictions that have always plagued modern capitalist cultures. We can't overcome his nostalgic conservatism through mere insistence, even when this insistence is backed by state power. Instead, we have to develop our own critique of the present and overcome these contradictions for ourselves. Here at the Zero Books channel, we plan on doing just that. In the weeks to come, we'll be selecting a few Jordan Peterson videos and lectures and responding to them from our own left perspective. But until then, thanks for watching.
The Marxist ideas are actually quite attractive if you're an intellectual, and if you're, I would say, if you're tilted towards compassion from a personality perspective, because they're based on doctrines like from each according to his ability, to each according to his need. And the idea that you should fulfill people's needs, or that society should fulfill people's needs, is on the surface of it an attractive idea. Of course, the problem is who gets to define the needs and who gets to define the abilities, and that really is a big problem. And, well, and then those ideas were put into practice first in the Soviet Union, and Alexander Solzhenitsyn, who wrote the Gulag Archipelago, did a